There's a letter that Prabhupada wrote to Yogeshwara Prabhu. He was the temple president in Paris at this time, and he was struggling to manage the temple, and he was also in charge of the BBT there. So he had to get, at least the Back to Godhead magazine published every month. Prabhupada was pushing him, and he was finding it a little difficult. A lot of responsibilities were on his head. So he wrote to Srila Prabhupada, and Prabhupada had seen a copy of the French BTG, and he wasn't particularly happy with it because he had included, Yogeshwara had included some advertising just from ordinary karmi businesses, like non-devotee sources. And so Prabhupada wrote back to him and told him that he didn't like seeing the adverts in the BTG. Of course, in the very, very early days, in 66 and 67, when Prabhupada revived the Back to Godhead, as I mentioned, that he was working through Back to Godhead as his main preaching tour until 1960. Then when he started writing the Srimad Bhagavatam, then he put the BTG aside. Not that he, finished with it, but he had to temporarily suspend it. When he came to America, and then he started getting a following, and many of those young men, like Brahmananda, Hayagriva, Kirtananda, they were all college graduates, very educated people. So then Prabhupada saw, now I have to somehow or another give these boys an engagement. He'd begun preaching, they were responding to the preaching. So then the next thing is that if, you have to do something with the results of your preaching. It's not that you simply talk and then go away. You get some result. That result is that people want to take up Krishna consciousness and be engaged full time in devotional service. So Prabhupada had a little tiny storefront, that was it. That was the whole of ISKCON. So he had to figure out, now these boys are coming, what am I going to do with them? They can't just eat prasadam and sleep. So he saw an opportunity. These boys are educated. Hayagriva was an English editor. Ray Rama had been involved with some production of some magazines. So he immediately told them, all right, I have this Back to Godhead that I was doing, now you do it. So he gave that publication to his disciples. So in the beginning it was very simple, very crude. They had what was called a cyclist style mimeograph. It was a hand crank machine, printing machine. And you made a template, then you wound the drum around, and then it impressed from the template onto single sheets of paper. And you get probably about 100 reproductions from each template. So this is how they were doing the Back to Godhead, on single sheets, hand printed. And then they had to collate them and then staple them together. That was the binding. And then Gagamuni was taking stacks of them out in a kind of a hand barrow and selling them all around the East Village in New York. But then very quickly, they started progressing and developing. But right at the very beginning, because they had no money, they started inviting, different businesses in the East Village there to take out advertisements. So they print those in the Back to Godhead. But a lot of the advertisements, of course, were not only not Krishna conscious, some of them were advertisements for things that we, prescribe. So after a short period, Prabhupada told the devotees, no more advertising. Now we can sell enough that we can support ourselves. So at the beginning of the French BTG, in 69-70, then I guess Yogeshwara got the idea that as they had previously, then we could pay for the publication of Back to Godhead by taking paid advertisements. Then that was sent to Srila Prabhupada, but now Prabhupada was not very happy with it. ISKCON was, much bigger than it had been in 66, and there was no need, he felt, for these advertisements to be there. So he wrote a letter back to Yogeshwara in December of 1971, and he told him, I don't think that there is a need to divert your attention by producing advertising. I have seen your advertisements as shown by me shown to me by Shama Sundar, and I think that you have made the thing less important. So reduce the, spiritual potency in the magazine, having these mundane advertisements. This kind of ad is not good. It is not grave. You have something more important to say than me, or don't disturb. Thank you. Our process is to show Krishna consciousness as it is, not as others want to see it. This is a very important principle of preaching. Show Krishna consciousness as it is, not as other people want to see it. By showing Krishna consciousness in this way, you are making the thing less important. It is not that we should change to accommodate the public, but we should change the public to accommodate us. That's Prabhupada. I'm not going to learn how to use a knife and fork. I'm going to teach people how to forget it. Same thing. We're not going to change to accommodate the public's desires. We change the public to accommodate what we want or what we have. Better you devote your full time to one thing only and not many things. That way your enthusiasm and talents will have a big effect by being concentrated. So if you remember the first part of this letter I read out yesterday, where Prabhupada's, the question was, what's the priority? And then Prabhupada said, everything is important. You can't sacrifice one thing in order to do another. But he also gave that little leeway there, that according to your capacity, then you have to act. So now he's being more specific, and he tells him that better you devote your full time to one thing only and not many things. So he wanted everything to be done. They were all equally as important. But the capability of his manager had to be taken into consideration. So this is an important factor in management. There's so many things that need to be done, but you can't expect people to do more than what they're naturally capable of. So that way then you have to find the best way to engage each individual and focus their energy to be very effective. So therefore he's saying that your enthusiasm and talents will have a big effect by being concentrated. So you're kind of letting him off the hook a little bit there. All right, if you can't do everything, then at least do something really well. So that way then anyway, the point that I was making about a clear structure. Prabhupada, it's not that when he came to America, he didn't have some, already some map, if you like, in his head about how he was going to spread Krishna consciousness. There were many plans that he had. There were many specific vehicles that he wanted to use for preaching. But according to the facility that was available, then he had, a limited opportunity to do that. But it doesn't mean that they weren't there. So within a very short period, you see from 1966 to 68, ISKCON was quite small. There were only about 4 or 5 temples. But then Prabhupada personally told me that actually this movement really began in 1968 onwards. That was when it really started to take off. So from the beginning of 68, there were about 5 temples. By the end of 1970 or 71, about 4 years later, there were about 55 temples. He'd gone from about 50 disciples to about 500 or 600 disciples, and ISKCON was all over the world, on every continent, and growing very, very rapidly. So it expanded about 10 times its size in about 3 or 4 years. And similarly, from 71 until 1977, the number of disciples went from 500 or 600 to about 5,000. And same with the temples, the number of temples doubled to about 108 when Prabhupada left the planet. An incredible expansion, and Prabhupada had to figure out how to engage literally thousands of people in regular devotional service in a productive way, both for themselves individually and for the society as a unit. So he had all of that planned out. It was just a question of when the opportunity could come, when he could introduce different things. So we see he started off, with these little preaching centers. Very quickly he started introducing deity worship. From 68 onwards, he was talking about, introducing deity worship in every temple. He had the ashrams more clearly defined. At the beginning, of course, everybody just knew him as Swamiji. He could more or less just kind of stroll in and out of Prabhupada's rooms, and he would sit there and be happy to talk for hours. But gradually, as they got more and more trained up, Prabhupada started introducing the concept of ashrams. Brahmacharya ashram. In 68, then Kirtananda and Hayagriva had got this land in West Virginia, and they wanted to start this new Vrindavan farm. So then Prabhupada saw that as an opportunity then to more properly establish the Grihastha ashram. Then in 1970, as I mentioned, Prabhupada started giving sannyas. So the sannyas ashram started coming about, and ISKCON started to get a shape and a form which was very, very similar to the Gaudiya Math. Prabhupada had already got the template from his Guru Maharaj, and as soon as he got the chance, he started introducing that structure into ISKCON, but with some important additions. One of them, as we just read, was the introduction or establishment of a GBC in 1970, so that Prabhupada could supervise them, train them up, and then make sure that by the time his time came to leave, that there was a solid managerial structure in place which would carry through, all of his teachings and practices. And it's interesting actually, because in 1976, in November, Prabhupada received a package, I think from Satsvarup Maharaj, and it was a paper that had been written by a professor. What was his name? Professor Kenny from Arkansas, Little Rock University in Arkansas. And this man, he had been studying the Krishna Consciousness movement. He'd been following it. And every year in America, they have this meeting of the American Academy of Religions. And it's usually around November, December time. And all the the professors that are involved with religious studies or whatever, they all go to that. So this Professor Kenny, he wrote a paper about Srila Prabhupada, and it was called A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami as Swami, Guru, and Avatar. And then he traced out, by reading all back to Godheads and by interviewing devotees, the development of ISKCON and the transformation of Srila Prabhupada's role in ISKCON. So first of all, the first couple of years he was just the Swami, everybody's friend, very open, easy access. It was like a family atmosphere, New York, San Francisco, all those places. But then he points out that when the land was obtained in Vrindavan, New Vrindavan, then the opportunity came for Prabhupada to introduce the Grihastha ashram, and he started advising married couples to go and stay there. And then, of course, as I said, the sannyas ashram came about more clearly in 1970. So this man, Mr. Kenny, he traced out that Prabhupada morphed, in one sense, or revealed himself more. First of all, he was just the Swami. Then he became the Guru. And ISKCON became, a very recognizable institution. Instead of just being a loose, combination of few followers, in a simple setting, started to become much more formalized and institutionalized, and there was distinctions between the different ashrams. And then with the introduction of, the deities and the regular program, Mangalarti started coming in, and the morning, what we call the morning program, that only really started to develop from 1970 onwards, greeting the deities. We played the Govindam record by George Harrison. So obviously that wasn't made until 1970. Prior to that, there was no real morning program as we recognize it now, but it came in. And as soon as there was any kind of opportunity to improve things, Prabhupada took it. When he heard that Govindam album, that song, Govinda, by Jamuna, he was so happy he was crying. And he thought it was so wonderful. He said, now every morning when we greet the deities, you play this record. So now it's an ISKCON standard, it's a tradition. You're not allowed to greet the deities without playing the god in the mountain. That came about in 1970. So there was this development. So Prabhupada went from being the Swami to becoming the Guru. You know, very formal teaching, very Guru means heavy, you know, rules and regulations that had to be followed. Just not quite apart from the four regular principles, but you know, the standards of sadhana bhakti, Prabhupada started introducing. So then Professor Kenny's estimation was that eventually Prabhupada would not just be the Guru, but he would then, probably after his death, he would become an avatar, that he would be recognized by his followers as an avatar. And then he was careful to point out that I don't mean in the sense that he becomes one with God, as some other, you know, organizations claim. The ISKCON devotees would find that offensive, but that he would be like a Shakti-Vaisha avatar. That he's a person who's a representative of God, he has the same potency as God, but he's not God. And Prabhupada would be recognized as a Shakti-Vaisha avatar. So this was his paper. I've included that actually in my Transcendental Diary series. I think it's in volume 5 as an appendix. You can read that paper. So when that paper arrived in Vrindavan, then Jagadish Prabhu, he was Prabhupada's secretary, he read it out to Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada was interested to see what the professor had written. And at the end of it, he didn't say much, but he said he's a very intelligent man. So he liked that, you know, how this professor had seen how he had transformed his role from being a simple Swami to being a Guru, and then eventually to being an avatar. So Prabhupada liked it. It was very interesting. So anyway, the point that I'm making here is that Prabhupada had clear understandings, like a map of what he wanted ISKCON to be. It was just a question of time before he could introduce all these different elements. So temples, the sadhana, you know, the strict sadhana that we have, the BBT, that was another thing that he had to develop, publishing his books. That became a phenomenal thing. You know, we talked yesterday about the writing of the Bhagavatam and how, from one point of view, it would have seemed to be hopeless, actually, to take up such a task of publishing the Bhagavatam, the entire 18,000 verses, when you're already 64 years old. What hope have you got of completing it? I found actually an interesting comment that Prabhupada makes on that point. Let me just see if I can find it. And this is Srila Prabhupada's rationale for why he undertook this service of presenting the Bhagavatam. Okay, this is from the preface to the second volume of the first canto. So this was written in India by Srila Prabhupada. And he explains why he's undertaking the task of producing the Bhagavatam in English. He says, an unbeliever friend became astonished to learn that we have taken up a mighty project for presenting 60 volumes of 400 pages each, simply for the matter of glorifying the Lord. But we should not forget to remember that the Lord is unlimited. This material world is a fragmental portion of his unfathomable glories, out of which this tiny earth is a particle only. And on the surface of the earth there are numberless cities, and in each and every one of them there are hundreds of printing houses, all engaged in the matter of broadcasting the message of this limited space. We can just imagine how many hundreds of thousands of volumes we may need to glorify the activities of the Lord, of the unlimited Lord. Therefore, 60 volumes of the Srimad Bhagavatam is just a sample distribution of his glories, presented in a manner understandable by the stagnant brain of the residents of this insignificant globe. Otherwise, the residents of higher planets, who have got superior brains than men, They do go through thousands and millions of volumes of the Srimad Bhagavatam to know about the glories of the Lord. So for Prabhupada, it was not like an insurmountable task to produce a 60-volume work on the Bhagavatam in his old age. For him, it was actually a very small thing compared to what's going on. You know, so many things have been printed, how many newspapers are coming out every single day all around the world, just to talk about, you know, Gram Katar, basically. That's all. But death, disease, and old age. Krishna is far more unlimited than this tiny enclosed, you know, space that we live in, this tiny little planet that we're on in the middle of this vast cosmos. So Prabhupada is saying, actually, this is nothing, 60 volumes. He didn't think that it was a big challenge. He thought that it, you know, was a small thing that he was doing to glorify Krishna. So this is Prabhupada's realization, his intent, and setting up the BBT. Then that was a very important thing, as we saw, you know, all the publications that were coming out from the Gaudiya Mat. Same thing. It was just exactly what his spiritual master had been doing. Now Prabhupada reintroduced it in the form of ISKCON. Ravinda Swarup Prabhu sometimes refers to the Gaudiya Mat as the beta version. Beta, you know, when you do a computer program and they have a first edition, it's not quite you know, worked out. They call it the beta version. Then you get the, you know, the proper version. So the Gaudiya Mat was kind of like the precursor to ISKCON. What the Gaudiya Mat was supposed to be, that's what Prabhupada introduced into ISKCON. So in that way then, the BBT, another thing that Prabhupada introduced was the farming communities, the idea of self-sufficiency. You know, Gitanagari farm and Tennessee farm, you have Australian farms. So that was another plan that Prabhupada had. He was waiting till he could introduce. Schools, that's another thing that Prabhupada introduced, gurukuls. Don't send your children to the slaughterhouses of modern material education. As he, you know, progressed with his preaching, more people were joining. They were all young. Most of us were single, but of course we're very, you know, energetic and passionate. So very soon, devotees wanted to start getting married. Prabhupada established the Grihastha Ashram. The natural result of the Grihastha Ashram is lots of kids. And what are you going to do with them? So Prabhupada had another plan for having a Gurukul system, and he was very clear about what that meant, you know, how it should be conducted. So that was another thing he introduced. Varnashram, because that's something that we're still struggling to introduce, a clear Varnashram system. But that was another plan of Prabhupada's. He spoke about it extensively from about 1974 onwards. Prior to that, I remember reading an article by Karanda Prabhu in one of the early Bhakti Godheads, 1972, I think, where he was explaining that ISKCON was trying to establish at least, you know, a group of Brahmins, Brahminically minded people with good brains that could lead the rest of the human population. But and I remember he said, to try to establish the entire Varnashram system would be a rather fanatical endeavor. That would be beyond our, you know, scope of activity. But by 1974, Prabhupada changed that and started talking clearly about the introduction of Varnashram. And by 1977, when we got to Mayapur in February of 77, we had a long conversation on February the 14th where Prabhupada very clearly stated that he wanted the Varnashram system to be introduced. That ISKCON should demonstrate that system so that ordinary people can see the proper organization of human society. So Varnashram was another thing that he had to introduce. The diorama displays, again another thing that he'd taken from his spiritual master. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, they set up a diorama displays that it was so big and so amazing, 30,000 people a day were coming in to see that exhibition. And then he was going to ship it all the way to Dhaka and show it there as well. So Prabhupada, you know, knew the potency of these kinds of visual arts, and especially dioramas, dolls. So again, he wanted his devotees to introduce that. And in 1976, 77, in Los Angeles, they actually created this, what they call the first American theistic exhibition, or Fate. It was a museum with dioramas made by Prabhupada's own disciples, Bharadwaj and others, and showing, you know, the whole philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita. That was another one of Prabhupada's plans that he got from his Guru Maharaj. So all of these things then, clear structure. Prabhupada had lots of plans. I think I mentioned when we were up on the roof in New York, Tamal Krishna Maharaj mentioned that all of these different things that you wanted, you know, now they're all here in this one building. Do you have any other plans, other things that have not yet been introduced? Prabhupada said yes. And then he didn't say anything more. So then Tamal Krishna laughed and he said, well, are you going to tell us? Prabhupada said no. And then he mentioned this Chanaka sloka, that whatever's in your mind, don't reveal it until the time when you want to actually execute it, because if you speak it too soon, somebody will come along and spoil it. So Prabhupada had more plans. But as he said, I've given you a basic structure. 1977, February, Prabhupada was very sick. He was very frail, and he was really starting to show symptoms of serious disease. So I remember standing on the balcony of the Lotus building with him after breakfast one morning. And then Prabhupada looked at me and he said, I want to spread Krishna consciousness everywhere at once. That was Prabhupada's ambition, to spread Krishna consciousness everywhere at once. He said, still anyway, he said, something is there, some basic thing is there. He had 108 temples that he created in 10 years. But for Prabhupada, that was just a tiny beginning. It was a little humble offering compared to his ambition. But, you know, that's what he got. So, Prabhupada, you know, he had big plans, always. You look in the 1950s, I mentioned the story about the 1930s, when he had that conversation with Abhiyal Kapoor about the tonic of love of Godhead. And even then he was saying, I know the formula and I'll preach it all over the world. So Prabhupada had a very clear idea of what he was about, and that's why he was so expert. He knew what he was doing, he knew what he wanted, he knew, you know, from studying and experiencing the growth of the Gaudiya Math, what works and what doesn't work. And at the same time, of course, he was flexible enough to be able to introduce the same systems into countries that didn't have a natural culture to support it. In India, still, you have some kind of religious culture, spiritual culture. It helps to sustain things more easily. In the West, nothing. They have no idea about spirituality. Even their religions, they think they are the body. That's the problem. So Prabhupada had to figure out how to adapt this pure spiritual culture into these Malacha Yavana, you know, manifestations. But he did that because he had a clear idea. He was not befooled or bewildered. He knew exactly what he wanted, and it was just a question of time. So there's more time for ISKCON to grow. There are more manifestations of this movement which will come in the future. We're just seeing the beginning of it. One simple example is since the time of Srila Prabhupada, then, you know, ISKCON has kind of morphed into this huge conglomerate of congregations. In our time, in the 1970s, you know, you were either in the temple or you were out of it. That was it. There was no congregational structure, practically speaking. We'd started making life members in India, but that was a slightly different thing. But in the West, you were either in the temple and therefore you were Krishna conscious, or you were out of the temple and therefore you were in Maya. Gaudiya tells the story of how they invented this word, bloop. We used to say that if somebody left the temple, then they were blooping. So that bloop means that there's the ocean of material existence. If you drop a stone into water, it goes bloop. So the person leaving the temple meant now he was going into Maya, falling down into the ocean of material existence. He was blooping. Like that. Even Prabhupada liked that word, so he used to use it as well. So anyway, the point is that nowadays we don't talk about people blooping anymore. You can be in the temple or out of the temple and still be Krishna conscious. And in fact, the majority of ISKCON devotees don't live in the temples. They live outside. There's this huge congregational development that's gone on since, the last 20 years or so. So that's something, that's developed over the years. It took some time to, fructify, if you like. But there'll be other things. There'll be other aspects of Krishna consciousness which will develop in the coming, decades or generations to come. Let's see where we go. But as far as Prabhupada is concerned, the Krishna consciousness movement is destined to become the world religion. It will become the prominent religion in the world because no philosophy in the world is superior to that of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Achincha Bheda Tattva. Nobody has any conception, similar to what is there in the Bhagavatam, Chaitanya Charitamrita. It's by far superior. So it's inevitable that it will ultimately become, very prominent and powerful. And then who knows what structures will be there when you have whole countries that are Krishna conscious, or where the national religion is, Krishna consciousness or Vaishnavism. So we're just at the beginning, but we can see from Prabhupada and his activities, he had that clear idea, he had clear understanding, he was taking everything from his Guru Maharaj, not concocting anything, and therefore he was very, very successful. But it took time. So some patience is required as well. Okay, so that's the first topic. We're nearly out of time. Clear goals. If you want to be successful as a manager, you have to know what you're trying to do. If you don't know, then nobody else will know, and it's just confusion. So the next item that I got for management is enthusiasm. And because Rupa Goswami mentions this is the first item, enthusiasm, that you have to, without enthusiasm nothing can be done. I put that as the second item because if you're enthusiastic but you don't have any idea about what your goals are, then you'll just make a mess. It'll be like a monkey. Monkeys are very enthusiastic but they have no idea how to behave properly or do anything constructive and useful, so they just wreck everything. So enthusiasm is required, but clear direction and goals have to be there to direct that enthusiasm. So there's a letter that Prabhupada mentions where again he uses this phrase, the art of management. So this was to Karanda in December of 72. He says, our leaders should be careful not to kill the spirit of enthusiastic service, which is individual and spontaneous and voluntary. They should try always to generate some atmosphere of fresh challenge to the devotees so that they will agree enthusiastically to rise up and meet it. This is the art of management, to draw out the spontaneous, loving spirit of sacrificing some energy for Krishna. That's the expertise of the manager, to keep everybody enthusiastic. Because you have to be enthusiastic yourself if you want to make anybody else enthusiastic. But the key essential ingredient, especially in a movement like ours, as he says, is spontaneous, it's voluntary. So there has to be this ability or endeavor to maintain everybody's enthusiasm. Then things will go on. But if people become disappointed, they lose their enthusiasm, you become listless, you can't do anything, your brain doesn't work anymore, you certainly don't feel like, putting yourself out and, practicing austerities, which are necessary actually for the spread of the Krishna consciousness movement. The austerity of preaching, that's the highest austerity, just like nowadays, this month, this is Purushottam Mass. A lot of people are saying special things have to be done, you get special credits and benefits from doing certain practices in Purushottam Mass. Or like let's say Kartik or whatever. But Prabhupada always said that if you're out preaching, you're already doing more than any of these other things. The value of what you're doing far exceeds all the other accumulated benefits and credits that you can get, you know, from offering a lamp or doing this or doing that. If you're out preaching, it is the best, it's the most austere platform in one sense, because you have to sacrifice your own life and energy for the sake of others. You do these little pujas, special pujas at different times of the year, that's nice. That's for our benefit and our purification. But when you go out preaching, you put aside your own considerations for the benefit of others, and therefore it is considered to be the highest level of performance of devotional service. And if you're engaged in preaching work, you don't need to do all these other things, they're already included. So Prabhupada is saying there then, this spontaneous loving spirit of sacrificing some energy for Krishna. This is what we're all about. To get people to a point where they're very happy to sacrifice for the pleasure of the Supreme Lord. That's what gives them pleasure, that's what gives Krishna pleasure, and that's what gives pleasure to everybody else. So the art of dealing with people in such a way that that enthusiasm is maintained, that, you know, voluntary eagerness, if you like, to spread Krishna consciousness. This is the essence of management. Yeah, we're not hire and fire. We don't, of course we have hired workers, but our devotees, we work voluntarily. We don't expect a wage. Maybe some minimum thing may be given in some circumstances. But Prabhupada always stressed that everything has to be done voluntarily, not as a matter of business. If you make it a business, the whole thing becomes spoiled. It may have the appearance of something nice, but the core of it, there's nothing spiritual. Real spirituality means this loving spirit of sacrificing some energy for Krishna. Yeah? So a manager has to know, for each individual, how to maintain their enthusiasm and keep them in this loving mood. So, as I said, you can't make anybody else enthusiastic unless you're enthusiastic yourself. And that's the one thing that Prabhupada had in abundance, as we've seen that letter from the governor of Bihar. You know, don't ask for anything, don't send any manuscripts, don't ask for money, don't ask for connections. No, don't even come. Still Prabhupada went. That's enthusiasm. Yeah, that's enthusiasm. So, 1976, December, Prabhupada was here in Bombay, and I went into his room one morning. I don't remember the context, but Prabhupada told me, he said that, you know, I never went to the West to become successful. I went there because it was the order of my Guru Maharaj. I was just trying to please him. So he said, now, without this enthusiasm, this utsaha, he said, I could never have left Vrindavan. Prabhupada was fine. He was situated on the transcendental platform. He was living in Vrindavan, you know, the ultimate place to be. But still, he wanted to do something for his Guru Maharaj. So that drove him to go beyond the thought of his own comfort and his own pleasure. To leave Vrindavan and go into the middle of hell, New York City, the Bowery, drunkards lying on the street right in front of you, passing stool and urine. I mean, that's what it was like where Prabhupada was living. He left Vrindavan for that because he had this enthusiasm to try to please his spiritual master. And everything else was secondary, you know, to that. Same thing when he was preaching in Jhansi. Yeah. In the 1950s, Prabhupada was working very, very hard to try to establish some kind of preaching field for himself, but nothing seemed to come of it. There's an interview that I think Siddhanta Prabhu, he's done that memory series where he interviews disciples of Prabhupada, and he's recorded that, you know, by film, and then he's put that into book form. So he interviewed the very first disciple of Srila Prabhupada, this Prabhakar Mishra. He gave him the name Haridas. So there was a group of medical students that were living with Prabhupada in this place that he was renting in Jhansi in the 1950s. And he was trying to train them up. He was trying to, you know, get them to take up not just Krishna consciousness for themselves, but get them interested in preaching. And he always had this plan in the 1950s that if he could get a couple of trucks and some brahmacharis, then they would travel, you know, with all the equipment in one truck, and then all the manpower in the other truck, and they would travel from village to village all around India and chant, distribute prasadam, and some books. And that was his plan, actually, for spending his life preaching, traveling from village to village. So even in Jhansi, he was trying to do that, although he had no brahmacharis. Sometimes he would go to a rich man's house and see he'd got several sons, and he would suggest to them, why don't you give me your eldest boy? I'll train him up to be a Pukka Brahmin, and then we'll go out preaching. No. No need for that. Nowadays, that's finished. Now we need technology. So that was the response he was getting. He couldn't get any brahmachari assistance. Even these medical students were not really serious. They liked him, but they were more interested in their careers. Just this one man, Prabhupada Misri, showed a little bit more initiative, and so Prabhupada initiated him. But he said, I didn't initiate the others because they weren't interested. So Prabhupada Misra, he recalls how Prabhupada was so enthusiastic to preach, he would want to go out on Padayatra, walking from Jhansi to wherever the local villages were. But none of the others would want to go with him. So sometimes just Prabhupada and Prabhupada would go, walking and chanting all the way. And sometimes when he wasn't available, Prabhupada would go out on his own. He would just walk to some village, chanting all the way. He'd stay there for some time and chant, and then he would walk all the way back, chanting all the way. That was Prabhupada's enthusiasm. There was no apparent, result from that. But he didn't mind. His enthusiasm was just trying to please his spiritual master's instructions. So let's see. So, in the course of preaching, of course, you have to mix with different people, different devotees. Not everybody agrees with you, what you want to do. And Prabhupada was no exception. Amongst his God brothers, there were those that were not keen to support what he wanted to do. I already mentioned yesterday how when he left Jhansi and he went to Mathura, to his God brother's temple there, then they asked him, because he was known to be a literary man, so they wanted him to manage the magazine. So when Prabhupada took over the management of the magazine, he immediately had big plans. He wanted hundreds of thousands or millions of copies. That was his vision. But he was told, no, just keep it small. Don't try to do anything more than what's already there. Just maintain it. For Prabhupada, that was like death. Just maintain it, keep it small. That was not Prabhupada. He wanted, something on a huge scale all around the world. So he left. Yeah? So his God brothers were not supporting him. He was all alone, working very hard. Trying to get this back to Godhead out. He was very determined about that. He would do all the writing himself. He would do all the editing himself. He would go to the printer and supervise the layout. He would go personally and buy the paper. And then when it was all printed, he would go out himself and sell it. And that enthusiasm, sometimes caused him a lot of problems. One time we were in Vrindavan. We had a management meeting. Kainana was there, Gopal Krishna Maharaj was there, a few of the other temple managers were there. Prabhupada was trying to, improve the management of the Vrindavan temple. Somehow or another, it was always not quite to his satisfaction. So he had a management meeting. Then after about 45 minutes or an hour, Prabhupada sat back, he said, all right. He said, that's it for today, enough. And he was rubbing his head. And he said, I'm getting brain fag. So I'd never heard that expression before. I said, brain fag, Srila Prabhupada, what's brain fag? So Prabhupada looked at me and said, brain fag. And then he told me this story. He said, just like one time I was out in Delhi selling my Back to Godhead magazine. So he said it was very hot and I was out in the sun. So he said I developed brain fag. And I was reeling like a drunkard. He was collapsing. And just at that moment, then a car went past. It was one of his friends. So this man happened to just drive past just as Prabhupada was collapsing. He stopped his car, took him in it, took him to his home, gave him some medicine, and then after some time he was okay again. Prabhupada said it was Krishna's arrangement that this friend just happened to drive past just at that moment. But that was Prabhupada, that was his enthusiasm. That he was going out to the point where he was collapsing in the street, literally, physically collapsing, out of enthusiasm for pleasing the spiritual master and doing this preaching work. So Prabhupada, he had that kind of determination. Many others didn't really appreciate it, but that was him. So in 1972, Prabhupada got a letter from Guru Das. He was one of the early recruits, of course, in San Francisco. He played an important part in many different ways in the early days of the movement. So he had written a letter to Prabhupada, and I guess he was complaining about, some of the non-cooperation that he was getting from his godbrothers. So Prabhupada wrote back to him, and he says, "Do not be depressed. All along, my godbrothers gave me only depression, repression, compression. But still I continued strong in my duty. So never mind that there is some discouragement. Continue with your work in full enthusiastic Krishna consciousness, attitude of service." So don't worry what other people are saying. You do what you know is what your spiritual master wants you to do. That's the idea. Keep your enthusiasm always. Don't be depressed, repressed, and compressed. And then again, another letter to Rudra Das and Radhika Dasi. This is February of 72. Prabhupada says that, "So far you're telling me that some other devotees have discouraged you in the past. I also had trouble with some of my godbrothers, but I never let it affect my service. Because when one becomes fixed up in devotional service, he never allows anyone or any condition at all to hamper his service to Krishna or discourage him in any way." That's enthusiasm. No circumstance where you become discouraged. You're fixed on the platform of transcendental service to the Lord and His pure devotees. The results are up to them. Whether people respond or not, that's not the preacher's concern. We were on a morning walk in Melbourne in 1974. This was before I became Prabhupada's servant. And Prabhupada was stressing the need for book distribution as the best way to distribute Krishna consciousness. So I was thinking, well, we're doing a lot of book distribution. And in those days, Australia, the Australian Yatra, was actually the #1 Yatra in the world for a few months in book distribution. And because of that, Prabhupada agreed to come to the Melbourne Rath Yatra in June of that year. So we were on the morning walk, and Prabhupada made this comment about book distribution. And I was thinking, well, we're distributing lots of books, but there's hardly anybody joining. We had, just like 20 people in the Melbourne Temple, maybe the same number in Sydney, hardly anybody in Adelaide. It just, didn't seem to be having much effect, at least to my vision. So when I mentioned that to Prabhupada, that we're selling lots of books but nobody's coming, Prabhupada stopped and he looked at me quite sharply. He said, "That is not our concern." He said, "Your duty is to just go out and sell the books. The results are all up to Krishna." So that's, again, not working. People now in material life, they become enthusiastic by getting some reward. That if I do something in this particular way, then I'll get some money or I'll get some prestige or whatever it may be. That, excited by the idea of getting some selfish gain. In Krishna consciousness, the enthusiasm is entirely different. It's not for getting some gain for ourselves, but it's for doing good to others. And on the basis that we're doing it to please our spiritual master and Krishna. That's where the devotee's reward, if you like, comes in. He's not concerned about the reward, but the reward is automatically there. That by sacrificing one's energy for Krishna's service, Krishna becomes so pleased that he bestows his mercy on that person, and he becomes apparent to them. And then you enjoy the highest standard of pleasure anywhere in the universe. That comes from that enthusiasm to please Guru and Krishna. So Prabhupada had that, and I'm going to finish. It's getting late. I'm going to finish with one last little story about Prabhupada's personal enthusiasm. Because the second part of this is maintaining the enthusiasm of others. We've just been talking about one's own enthusiasm and Prabhupada's in particular. So again, the same person, Prabhakar Misra, in this interview that he did for the Memory Series, he recalls one time, middle of the night, he woke up and somebody's thumping on a mridanga in the next room, and he couldn't understand who's doing that, very vigorous playing of the mridanga. So he went in and he saw Srila Prabhupada was dancing around the room with the mridanga just by himself and playing the mridanga and chanting Hare Krishna. And he had this big garland of kadamba flowers around his neck. And Prabhupada was surprised because Jhansi, there's no kadamba trees. You couldn't get kadamba flowers in Jhansi. But Prabhupada had this big garland of them around his neck. So he was surprised. He asked Srila Prabhupada, what's happening? Where did you get the garland from? And Prabhupada told him, he said, Krishna gave me this garland. He said, and therefore he said, I'm chanting and dancing, out of appreciation for Krishna's gift. So that was Prabhupada. That was where, the ultimate level of enthusiasm comes from. That contact with Guru and Krishna. It affects you beyond anything material. It's more satisfying than anything we can imagine. And Prabhupada had that. And therefore you see that he had this unquenchable desire to spread Krishna consciousness on behalf of Guru and Krishna. Alright, so it's getting late. I'm going to finish at this point.